The man's silhouette moved with impossible speed through the grand, shadow-draped foyer of the mansion. A glint of metal, a muffled grunt, and an armed intruder collapsed to the marble floor in a heap of black tactical gear. The billionaire's heiress, Isabella Sterling, watched from the doorway of a reinforced room, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. What are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling as it was swallowed by the cavernous space. The man, her quiet groundskeeper, turned his head slightly, his face bruised but his eyes holding a calm intensity she had never seen before. "Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments." The modest groundskeeper's cottage, tucked away on the edge of the sprawling, opulent Sterling estate, was a world away from the mansion's cold grandeur. Late afternoon sun slanted through the small kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. At a simple wooden table, Logan Brooks was helping his 10-year-old daughter, Maya, with her homework. In his late 30s, Logan possessed a quiet strength, a solid presence that seemed to anchor the small room. Lines of weariness were etched around his eyes, faint trails that hinted at a history of intense discipline he worked hard to forget. His movements were economical and precise, a study in efficiency, whether he was pruning the estate's prize-winning roses or, as he was now, pouring a glass of milk for his daughter. He patiently leaned over her shoulder, his voice a gentle rumble as he explained a math problem. "But why does X have to be a secret number?" "It's silly," Maya complained, tapping her pencil against the workbook. A small frown creased her brow. A perfect miniature of his own. Logan's lips curved into a rare, soft smile. "Sometimes the most important things are hidden at first," he said, his gaze distant for a fleeting moment. "You just have to know how to look for them." He settled back into his chair, the worn wood creaking softly. He cherished these quiet moments, these fragile islands of peace in the stream of his life. The scent of freshly cut grass still clung to his work clothes, a clean, earthy smell that mingled with the aroma of the simple stew simmering on the stove. The sound of his daughter's occasional frustrated sigh, followed by the scratch of her pencil as she worked through the problem, was the only soundtrack he needed. These were the anchors of the peaceful existence he had so painstakingly built for them. Yet, beneath the surface of this tranquility, a low-level anxiety hummed constantly, a deep-seated fear that this fragile peace could be shattered as easily as a pane of glass. He pushed it down, a familiar act of will, forcing his focus back to the present, back to Maya. This life, this quiet, unassuming life, was for her. His past had been a necessary sacrifice, a price paid so she could have a future untouched by shadows. Meanwhile, in the main house, Isabella Sterling occupied a suite that was larger than Logan's entire cottage. The room was a testament to her father's wealth, filled with expensive art, designer clothes spilling from an open wardrobe, and furniture that looked more like museum pieces than functional objects. But for all its luxury, the space felt cold, impersonal, a gilded cage. Isabella, in her mid-20s, stood before a large wall-mounted screen, her posture poised and perfect, yet rigid. On the screen, the face of her father, a powerful, imposing man even through a video feed, looked back at her with an expression of mild impatience. "The Harrington Gala is not optional, Isabella," Mr. Sterling's voice boomed, devoid of warmth. "Our family must present a united front, especially with the new tech division launch." Isabella's jaw tightened. "A united front? You're on the other side of the world and I'm just part of the window dressing, as always. I'd rather—" "It doesn't matter what you'd rather," he cut her off, his tone final. "You have responsibilities. Wear the blue dress. It matches the company's new logo." The call ended abruptly, leaving Isabella staring at her own reflection in the blank screen. Frustration and a profound sense of isolation washed over her. She wandered her suite, her fingers trailing over the cool, smooth surfaces of objects she didn't truly see. She felt like just another one of her father's acquisitions, a beautiful object to be displayed at the appropriate time, polished and presented to reflect his success. Her gaze drifted to the large window overlooking the vast, manicured lawns. In the distance, she saw two small figures walking hand in hand along a gravel path. It was the groundskeeper, Logan, and his daughter. They were too far away to see clearly, but she could perceive the easy, unforced nature of their connection. A sharp pang of envy, so intense it almost stole her breath, struck her. She longed for that simple, genuine bond, a connection that wasn't transactional, a relationship that wasn't predicated on duty and appearance. As night fell, it brought with it a powerful storm that had been threatening all day. The wind began to howl, a mournful sound that whipped through the ancient trees lining the estate. Rain, driven by the gale, began to lash down in thick, silvery sheets. Logan was on his final rounds, his worn jacket pulled tight against the biting wind. He moved with a steady, unhurried pace, his boots sinking slightly into the rain-softened earth. He was checking the storm drains, ensuring they weren't clogged with leaves, and securing any loose equipment that might become a projectile in the high winds. It was routine work, the kind of task he could do on autopilot. But his instincts, honed by years of training he actively tried to forget, began to prickle. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a dissonance that his conscious mind couldn't immediately place. A security camera on the west perimeter fence was offline. He saw the dead feed on the small monitor in a junction box. He initially dismissed it as a weather-related glitch, a common occurrence in storms this severe. But a deeper part of him, a part that had been dormant for a decade, was unconvinced. The feeling was a cold knot in his gut, a familiar hum of wrongness. He followed the fence line, the wind tearing at him, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. Near the base of the dead camera's stanchion, half hidden in the churned-up mud, he found it. A wire freshly cut. The ends were clean, precise. It wasn't a storm break. It was deliberate. In that instant, his entire demeanor shifted. The gentle, weary father vanished, replaced by something else entirely, something harder and far more dangerous. The focused, alert operator took over. His shoulders squared, his head came up, and his eyes, no longer soft, pierced the darkness, scanning the dense tree line beyond the fence. The wind and rain were no longer just weather, they were cover. The shadows were no longer just an absence of light, they were potential threats. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen. But he wasn't calling security. He was pulling up the estate's schematic, a file he had for his landscaping work. He didn't need to study it, he had memorized it weeks ago. A cold dread washed over him, but it was a familiar sensation, the chilling prelude to a mission. This time, however, it was different. This time, the dread was laced with a terrifying, visceral fear that was entirely new. Maya was here. His daughter was sleeping soundly in their cottage, 100 yards from where he stood. The fear was not for himself, but for her. The potential conflict was no longer a vague feeling, a prickle of instinct. It was a certainty. The estate was being invaded. He broke into a sprint, his powerful legs eating up the ground, his movements silent and fluid. The storm, which moments ago had been an inconvenience, was now his ally, its roaring chaos masking his desperate, silent race back to the cottage, back to his daughter. He burst through the cottage door, a whirlwind of rain and grim purpose that immediately startled Maya. She looked up from her workbook, her eyes wide with alarm at the sight of her father, soaked and breathing hard, his face a mask of tension she had never seen before. In an instant, he forced the tension from his features, replacing it with a strained, unnatural smile. The effort was visible, a flicker of conflict in his eyes. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper that was meant to be reassuring but only amplified the strangeness of the moment. "We're going to play a game, the super-secret quiet game. I need you to hide in the cellar and not make a sound until I come get you. No matter what you hear, can you do that for me?" He didn't wait for an answer. Already moving toward the thick, braided rug in the center of the small living room. He pulled it aside, revealing the heavy, flush-mounted trapdoor to the cellar, a place they had sometimes used as a fort during thunderstorms, a game to make her feel safe. Tonight, it was not a game. He guided her toward the opening, his hand firm on her shoulder. "Is this because of the storm, Daddy?" Maya asked, her voice small and trembling, her gaze fixed on the dark, yawning space below. Logan knelt, bringing himself to her level. He looked directly into her eyes, pouring every ounce of conviction he could muster into his own. "Something like that," he lied, and the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "You'll be safe here. I promise." He hugged her tightly. A fierce, desperate embrace that lasted only a second before he helped her down the short, steep ladder. He watched her small form disappear into the cool darkness, her face a pale oval looking up at him. He closed the heavy cellar door, the solid thud echoing the pounding of his own heart, each beat a hammer blow of responsibility for the promise he had just made. For a moment, he stood there, the weight of that promise pressing down on him. Then, the operator took over again. He moved to the small attached tool shed, his hands working with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. He ignored the shovels and rakes, his fingers instead finding the heavy steel gardening trowel, its edge sharpened for cutting through tough roots. He tested its weight, its balance. Then, his eyes fell on a spool of thick, galvanized wire used for training climbing roses. He cut a long section, coiling it with a speed and precision that spoke of a dark, forgotten muscle memory. Armed with the crude, brutal tools of his peaceful life, he slipped back out into the raging storm. The estate grounds were a maelstrom of wind and water. Logan moved through the storm-swept landscape like a ghost, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He knew every dip in the terrain, every cluster of bushes that offered concealment, every blind spot in the security system he had mentally mapped out long ago. The howling wind and hammering rain were his allies, a cacophony that masked the sound of his passage. He circled wide, approaching the main house from the east, using a row of sculpted hedges as cover. Through the sheets of rain, he spotted the first intruder. The figure was clad in black tactical gear, a suppressed rifle held at the ready, moving with professional confidence toward the botanical greenhouse, likely using it as a covered approach to the mansion's west wing. Logan's path changed. He wouldn't let them get that close. He melted into the deeper darkness of the trees bordering the greenhouse, circling around, his boots making no sound on the saturated ground. He entered the greenhouse through a maintenance door he had left unlocked earlier in the day, the humid, cloying scent of damp earth and exotic flowers enveloping him. Rain hammered against the glass panes above, the sound deafening, isolating. He moved through the narrow aisles, a phantom among the ferns and orchids. The intruder was just inside the main entrance on the other side, shaking water from his gear, his back to the dense foliage where Logan now croaked. The takedown was swift, silent, and brutal. Logan exploded from behind a row of enormous exotic palms. He didn't aim for the head or torso. He used the sharpened trowel not as a digging tool, but as a weapon, a vicious, pointed hammer. He struck the man at the back of the knee, the impact shattering the joint and breaking his posture with a sickening, muffled crunch. The man gasped, his body collapsing forward, his rifle clattering against the stone floor. Before the gasp could turn into a cry, Logan was on him, the length of wire looping around the man's throat. It was a cold, mechanical sequence of movements, a deadly dance he had spent years trying to forget. He applied pressure, a silent, efficient chokehold that ended the struggle in seconds. He didn't feel triumph, only a grim, sickening familiarity in the act. He lowered the unconscious man to the ground, his face a mask of stone. He took the man's earpiece, a small, sophisticated piece of tech, and fitted it into his own ear. A distorted voice, filtered through static and the roar of the storm, crackled to life. "Team 2, report. Is the West Wing clear?" There was a pause, filled only with static. The voice came again, sharper this time, laced with impatience. "Team 1, proceed to the primaries chamber. We need the asset." Logan's blood ran cold. The asset. This wasn't a simple robbery, a smash and grab for jewels and art. This was a professional abduction, and the primaries chamber could only mean one thing: Isabella's suite. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just been raised into the stratosphere. His mission had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the woman in the mansion, the asset these men were so determined to acquire. Inside the main house, Isabella had been jolted from a restless sleep by the sound of a window shattering downstairs. It wasn't the storm, it was the sharp, percussive sound of impact, followed by a faint, chilling draft that seemed to snake its way up the grand staircase. Her heart leaped into her throat. Instinct, and her father's paranoid insistence, took over. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled out of bed and ran, not for the hallway but for the library adjoining her suite. Her fingers fumbled along the edge of a towering built-in bookshelf until they found the hidden seam. She pushed, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing the cold steel door of the panic room her father had installed years ago. She slipped inside the small, sterile box, sealing the heavy door behind her just as she heard the thud of heavy footsteps in the library outside. Muffled voices followed, tense and guttural. Then, a new sound began, a high-pitched metallic whine that set her teeth on edge. A drill. They were drilling the door. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. The room, designed to be her ultimate sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She frantically reached for the panic room's dedicated phone line, a direct, hardwired connection to the local police. She lifted the receiver to her ear. It was dead. The line was silent, inert. They had cut it. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own fortress, listening to the methodical, terrifying sound of her last defense being dismantled, inch by agonizing inch. Meanwhile, Logan had entered the house through a ground-floor service entrance in the kitchen wing, the lock picked with a thin piece of metal from his keychain. The vast, stainless steel kitchen was dark and silent, save for the drumming of the rain against the windows. He moved through the space, a predator in a foreign environment, his senses on high alert. He rounded a large central island and came face to face with the second intruder. There was no surprise, just a flicker of mutual recognition of a shared, violent purpose. This one was bigger than the first, and the fight was not as clean. It was a desperate, close-quarters struggle. The man lunged, a combat knife flashing in his hand. Logan deflected the strike, the blade slicing through the fabric of his jacket and scoring a shallow line across his ribs. He grunted, ignoring the sting, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. As the intruder gagged, Logan twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the knife, and slammed his head against the edge of a steel countertop. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Logan's eyes immediately fell on the suppressed pistol holstered on the man's thigh. He took it, the cold, familiar weight of it settling into his palm. It felt both alien and sickeningly natural, a relic from a life he had tried to bury. He checked the magazine, chambered around, the soft click of the action barely audible over the storm. He could still hear the high-pitched whine of the drill, louder now, closer. It was coming from the direction of the main hall, from the library. He followed the sound, the pistol held low and ready, his every step silent, his purpose clear. He was no longer just the groundskeeper, he was the hunter. The library was a cathedral of shadows, its towering shelves of leather, bound books rising into the gloom like ancient sentinels. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of the storm and the high, piercing shriek of the drill biting into the reinforced steel of the panic room door. Logan moved along the edge of the room, a wraith gliding through the darkness, the captured pistol, a cold, dense weight in his hand. He saw them then, two figures silhouetted against the faint light spilling from the drill's entry point. They were focused, their bodies tense with effort, oblivious to the new presence that had joined them in the room. Logan's eyes scanned the environment, his mind a tactical computer processing variables and opportunities. A heavy, ornate globe on a brass stand stood near him. A rolling ladder leaned against a bookshelf. Thick, velvet curtains shrouded the tall windows. He needed a diversion, something to break their concentration and split their focus. He crept closer to the globe, his movements utterly silent. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the heavy sphere spinning. It wobbled on its axis for a second before crashing to the floor with a deep, resonant boom that echoed through the vast space. As one, the two men spun around, their weapons coming up, their eyes searching the darkness that had just birthed the sound. It was the opening Logan needed. He exploded from the shadows, not a man, but a force of pure, kinetic energy. He didn't fire the pistol. The report, even suppressed, would be a beacon to the other intruders. Instead, he used it as a bludgeon, a solid extension of his fist. He slammed the butt of the gun into the side of the first man's head, the impact sickeningly solid. The man dropped without a sound. The second intruder reacted faster, bringing his own weapon around, but Logan was already inside his guard. He deflected the man's arm, a combat knife appearing in the intruder's other hand, its blade arcing through the air. Logan twisted, but the tip of the blade caught him, slicing a deep, fiery gash along his forearm. A grunt of pain escaped his lips, but he didn't falter. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him stumbling backward into the path of the rolling library ladder. The man hit it hard, the ladder shooting away on its casters and slamming into a bookshelf, dislodging a cascade of heavy volumes. In that moment of imbalance, Logan struck, a precise, disabling blow to the man's throat. The intruder collapsed, gagging, his knife clattering on the priceless Persian rug. The drill, its work almost complete, whined one last time before falling silent. The immediate threat was over. Logan leaned heavily against the cool steel of the panic room door, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. The adrenaline sang in his veins, a wild, familiar music he had long tried to silence. The pain in his arm was a sharp, grounding counterpoint, a reminder of his own vulnerability. A wave of self-loathing, cold and bitter, washed over him as he looked at the two unconscious forms sprawled amongst the books. The efficiency of his own violence disgusted him. He had built a life of peace, of nurturing living things, yet the killer inside him had awakened as if it had only been sleeping. He pressed his ear to the door, listening. He could hear faint, ragged breathing from within. He had to get her out. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, realizing how it would sound. He took a deep, steadying breath, trying to force the gravel from his voice. "Miss Sterling?" he called out, his voice strained, rougher than he intended. "It's Logan Brooks, the head groundskeeper. Are you all right in there?" A sharp, terrified voice shot back from the other side of the door, laced with pure, undiluted fear. "Stay away from the door!" "How do I know you're not one of them?" Logan closed his eyes, the pain in his arm flaring. He had to think. He couldn't offer proof of who he was in this moment, only of who he had been in his quiet, unassuming role. He had to connect to her world, not his. "They're down," he said, his voice low and steady, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "For now. Last week you asked me to replant the white roses by the East Terrace. You said they reminded you of your mother's garden in the Hamptons. The old gardener, George, planted yellow ones by mistake, and you couldn't stand the color." The silence on the other side of the door was absolute, stretching for what felt like an eternity. Logan could hear his own heart pounding in his ears, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the storm. He waited, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Then, her voice came again, stripped of its sharp fear, now small and trembling, but clear. "The security code for the door is my mother's birthday. Backwards, 081973. Logan's fingers, slick with a mixture of rain and his own blood, fumbled for the keypad next to the door's seam. He punched in the numbers. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hiss of hydraulics, the impossibly heavy door swung inward. Isabella Sterling stood there, framed in the doorway of her sterile white sanctuary. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief, were fixed on him. She took in his disheveled appearance, his soaked and torn jacket, the dark, ugly gash on his forearm that was dripping blood onto her father's antique rug. Her gaze then flickered to the two unconscious, black-clad bodies lying amidst the scattered books. The image of the quiet, humble gardener, the man who trimmed her hedges and nodded politely when she passed, was irrevocably shattered, replaced by this bloodied, dangerous stranger who had just saved her life. Isabella's shock was a fragile thing, a thin layer of ice over a core of steel he was only just beginning to see. Her breath hitched, but her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly firm. "Who are you?" she demanded, the question hanging in the air between them, heavy with the weight of the impossible scene before her. Logan ignored the question. It didn't matter. Not now. He stepped past her, his eyes already scanning the library, assessing the new situation. "We need to move. Now," he said, his tone flat. "All business. There are more of them." He looked at the wound on his arm. It was bleeding freely, a steady dark seep. He strode to one of the tall windows, grabbed the thick velvet curtain, and with a powerful wrench, tore a long strip of the heavy fabric free. The sound of ripping cloth was loud in the sudden quiet of the room. He began to wrap the strip tightly around his forearm, his movements practiced and efficient, his teeth clenched against the fresh surge of pain. Isabella watched him, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the man standing before her. "You're the gardener," she said, her voice a half-whisper of confusion. "Gardeners don't. They don't fight like that." Logan finished knotting the makeshift bandage, pulling it tight with his teeth and his good hand. He met her gaze, his eyes dark and intense, holding a depth of experience she couldn't begin to fathom. "Tonight I do," he said simply. He turned his attention back to the room, his mind working like a tactical computer. He glanced toward the main hallway, then back at the shattered window in the adjoining room. "We can't get out. They'll have the exits covered. They're professionals. They'll expect us to run." He looked up at the high ceilings, his gaze sweeping the layout of the grand house that was now a battlefield. "We need a better vantage point, a place to regroup and make a stand." Isabella's fear, which had been a paralyzing, all-consuming force just moments before, began to morph into something else. It was a stunned curiosity, a dawning awe. This man, this quiet, unassuming employee who she paid less attention to than the floral arrangements in the foyer, was now her only hope. He moved with a purpose and a confidence that was both terrifying and profoundly reassuring. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of her safe, ordered world, she made a decision. She would trust him. Her life depended on it. For Logan, her presence was a complication, a civilian to protect in a combat zone. But it was also a responsibility that sharpened his focus, honing his senses to a razor's edge. He had to protect her, just like he had to protect Maya, who was hidden away in the dark, silent earth beneath his cottage. The two promises, one spoken and one implicit, merged into a single, overriding mission. He was no longer just a father protecting his child. He was a guardian, and the storm had just begun. Logan's gaze swept the opulent library, not as a room in a house, but as a tactical position that had been compromised. He gave Isabella a sharp, commanding nod. "This way," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. He didn't move toward the grand hallways or the main staircase, the obvious paths. Instead, he headed for a section of wall paneled in dark, unassuming oak, a part of the library Isabella had never paid any mind to. He pressed a specific point on the decorative molding, and a section of the wall clicked open, revealing not a safe or a hidden chamber, but a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air that drifted out was cool and smelled of dust and old wood. It was a service passage. He gestured for her to enter, his eyes already scanning the darkness beyond. Isabella hesitated for only a heartbeat before plunging into the unknown space after him. The panel clicked shut behind them, sealing them in near total darkness and muffling the roar of the storm to a distant, hollow moan. The passage was a stark, shocking contrast to the polished world Isabella knew. It was a working artery hidden behind the decorative skin of her home. Exposed pipes and thick bundles of wiring ran along the rough, unfinished walls. The floor was bare concrete, and the only light came from small, caged utility bulbs spaced far apart, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed with their movement. The forced proximity was immediate and intense. The corridor was so narrow that her shoulder brushed against his uninjured arm as they moved. She could smell the rain and the sharp metallic tang of blood on him, mingled with the clean scent of damp earth. She could see the grim, determined set of his jaw up close, the way a muscle jumped in his cheek. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that was utterly mesmerizing. He didn't just walk, he flowed through the space, his head on a constant, subtle swivel, his gaze piercing every corner, every intersection of passages, before they reached it. He was a creature of the shadows, completely at home in this hidden, functional world she never knew existed. It mirrored her new perception of him, the capable, dangerous man hidden behind the simple uniform of the groundskeeper. She found herself watching his hands, the good one holding the pistol with an easy familiarity, the other clenched into a fist at his side, the makeshift bandage a dark stain against his skin. This was the secret architecture of her life, the unglamorous machinery that made her gilded cage run. It was a world of maintenance, of function, of reality. And Logan, it was clear, was a man of reality. He navigated the labyrinthine passages with an unerring sense of direction, taking turns that seemed identical to Isabella, his memory of the estate's layout apparently flawless. He was leading them toward the west wing, toward the estate's central security hub. It was the brain of the house, and Logan clearly intended to see what it knew. As they moved, Isabella's mind raced. The quiet man who had once offered her a polite, distant smile was gone forever. In his place was this focused, lethal protector, a man who bled and fought and moved with the chilling efficiency of a purpose-built weapon, and she was following him without question, deeper into the darkness. They finally arrived at a heavy steel door marked with a simple stenciled sign, "Security." Logan paused, pressing his ear against the cold metal, listening for a full 10 seconds. Hearing nothing, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly, the pistol raised, his body a shield in front of the opening. The room beyond was bathed in the cold blue-white light of a bank of monitors. 2 guards were in their chairs, but they weren't watching the screens. They were slumped forward, their heads on their desks at unnatural angles, a pair of half-empty coffee mugs beside them, drugged, or worse. Logan swept the room with his gaze, confirming it was empty before waving Isabella inside. He moved immediately to the guards, checking their necks for a pulse. "They're alive," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. Isabella's attention was drawn to the wall of screens. Most of them were dark, displaying the same no-signal message Logan had seen at the perimeter fence. The intruders had been thorough, but a few cameras were still active, showing empty, rain-lashed courtyards and deserted, silent hallways. The house looked like a ghost ship. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the electronics and the distant howl of the wind. Suddenly, the largest monitor in the center of the bank flickered. The static cleared, replaced by a live feed from a camera Isabella recognized. It was in her father's master study, 2 floors below them. A man was standing in the center of the room, his back to a massive, unlit fireplace. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was handsome in a severe way, with high cheekbones, cold, intelligent eyes, and a cruel, thin smile that didn't reach them. He looked directly into the camera, as if he knew they were watching. And then he spoke, his voice coming through the intercom system in the security hub, smooth, cultured, and laced with venom. "Still resourceful, I see," the man said, his smile widening slightly. "Call sign Wraith, or do you prefer Logan now? You can't hide in the dirt forever." Logan froze. It wasn't a flinch or a startle. It was a complete cessation of movement, as if his entire nervous system had been severed. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pale, stony mask. He knew that voice. He knew that face. It was a ghost from a past he had killed and buried a decade ago. It was Petrov. A man he thought he'd never see again. A man he had prayed he would never see again. The pistol in his hand lowered slightly, his knuckles white. Petrov's voice, dripping with a chilling conversational malice, filled the small, sterile room again. He was toying with them, a cat with 2 cornered mice. "I must admit, I was surprised to find you here," he continued, taking a step closer to the camera, his eyes boring into Logan through the screen. "I heard you traded your rifle for a shovel, a quiet life, very noble. Did you think we'd all just forget about Operation Nightingale? Did you think the ghosts would just stay buried?" The name hit the air and seemed to hang there, heavy and toxic. Operation Nightingale. It meant nothing to Isabella, but to Logan, it was a key unlocking a chamber of horrors he had sealed long ago. The carefully constructed walls of his quiet life, already cracked and damaged by the night's violence, began to crumble into dust. Isabella looked from the man on the screen to the man beside her. She saw the flicker of agony in Logan's eyes, a raw, unguarded pain that made her own fear seem distant. "Operation Nightingale?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is he talking about? You were a soldier?" Logan's gaze remained locked on the screen, on the face of his past. He gave a single sharp nod, his throat working. "I was," he said, his voice low and strained, a raw, grating sound. "Special Forces." Petrov let out a soft, cruel laugh that crackled through the intercom. "He's being modest, little Heiress," he purred, his eyes glinting with malice. "He wasn't just a soldier, he was our leader, the man who led us into a trap, the man who walked away while the rest of us burned." The words were like physical blows, each one landing with precision, each one designed to inflict maximum pain. The guilt and failure from that final disastrous mission, the very reason he had left everything and everyone behind to disappear into a life of anonymity, came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. He could see the faces of his men, hear their voices, feel the heat of the fire and the sting of betrayal. He had spent 10 years running from this, 10 years building a new identity, a new life. Brick by painful brick, and in a single night Petrov had torn it all down. Isabella saw it all in his eyes. She saw the carefully constructed dam of his composure break, saw the flood of old nightmares pour through. The quiet, gentle father, the brutally efficient fighter, and now this, a haunted, broken leader. Her awe, which had been steadily growing all night, deepened, but now it was mixed with a profound, aching compassion. This man wasn't just a hero who had appeared out of nowhere to save her. He was a man with a history, a man carrying wounds far deeper than the gash on his arm. And the intruders, she realized with a chilling certainty, were not random. This wasn't about her, not really. This was personal. This was a reckoning, and she was caught in the middle of it. The revelations from Petrov landed in the sterile quiet of the security hub like a volley of grenades, tearing through the carefully constructed reality Logan had built for himself. For a long, silent moment, he simply stared at the face on the screen, the ghost from his past, and felt the old wounds, the ones he thought had scarred over, tear open anew. The pain was a white-hot agony in his chest, the familiar sting of failure and betrayal. But then, something else rose through the pain, something colder and harder than grief. It was resolve. The ghosts were no longer just in his head. They were here, in this house, and they had his daughter's life in their hands. Running was over. Hiding was over. Isabella watched the war play out on Logan's face. The haunted, broken look in his eyes was slowly being forged into something else, something terrifyingly focused. The last vestiges of the gentle gardener were burned away, leaving the cold, hard steel of the commander he once was. He turned from the monitor, his gaze sweeping over the bank of active camera feeds. But he was no longer looking for a way out. He was looking for a place to fight. "We're not getting out," he said, his voice regaining its steel, each word clipped and precise. The sound was so different from the soft, patient tone he used with Maya that it sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. "They have us boxed in. Every exit will be watched, every approach covered. Running is what they expect. It's what a civilian would do." He tapped a finger on one of the screens, bringing up a schematic of the main floor. His eyes, missing nothing, traced the lines and dimensions. "So we don't run. We make our stand here." His finger stopped, circling a large, cavernous space at the heart of the mansion. The grand ballroom. It was a vast, open room, a kill box by any military definition. But Logan saw something else. He saw its features not as decoration, but as assets. He saw traps where Isabella saw opulence. "Here," he repeated, a grim certainty in his voice. "We're going to turn their greatest advantage, their numbers and their aggression, into a weakness. We'll lure them into the open and use the environment against them." He turned to Isabella, his eyes locking onto hers, no longer seeing a billionaire's heiress, but a potential soldier in a desperate two-person army. "I need your help. You know this house better than anyone. I know tactics, but you know its secrets. Can you fight?" Isabella looked from his bloody, bandaged arm to the chilling resolve in his eyes. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a strange, fierce determination. Her life, her family's name, her entire world had been exposed as a lie tonight. This man, this haunted soldier, was the only truth she had left to cling to. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "What do we do?" They moved with a frantic, synchronized purpose, a strange and desperate alliance forged in the crucible of fear. The grand ballroom, a place that had hosted glittering galas and silent, stately auctions, was transformed into a workshop for improvised warfare. The cavernous room, with its polished marble floor, soaring ceiling, and trio of massive crystal chandeliers, became their battlefield. Logan was the director, his tactical mind seeing possibilities in every piece of decor. He moved with a fluid, economic grace, his earlier weariness burned away by the pure, cold fire of adrenaline and purpose. "That center chandelier," he said, pointing upward. The colossal fixture of crystal and brass hung like a glittering sword of Damocles over the center of the room. "We need to rig it to drop. Can we access the winch motor from the balcony?" Isabella's mind, usually occupied with guest lists and fashion, snapped into a new, practical focus. She followed his gaze to the ornate, wrought, iron balcony that ringed the second floor. "Yes," she said immediately, her knowledge of the house now a critical weapon. "There's a service panel behind that tapestry." She pointed to a huge, woven depiction of a medieval hunt. "My grandmother insisted on it when the house was rewired. She hated the noise of the motors during parties." While Isabella scrambled up the grand staircase to the balcony, Logan went to work on the ground floor. He and Isabella, working together, strained to push a heavy, bronze rodent statue from its pedestal, positioning it near the main entrance to the ballroom, creating a partial obstruction. Isabella, her hands raw and her designer dress smudged with dust, looked at the masterpiece of art they were now using as a barricade. "My father will have a fit if we scratch this rodin," she said, a breathless, hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. Logan didn't smile. He was checking the weight and balance of the statue, his expression grim. "He'll thank you when you're alive to hear him complain about it," he replied, his voice flat. The comment, devoid of humor, was more sobering than any warning. The chasm between their worlds, the billionaire's daughter and the groundskeeper, had vanished completely. It was replaced by the raw, terrifying equality of two people fighting for their lives, their different skills and knowledge complementing each other in a frantic dance of survival. She knew the secrets of the palace, he knew the strategies of the war zone. Together, they tore down the heavy velvet curtains from the tall, arched windows, laying the thick, heavy fabric across the floor near a side entrance, hoping to entangle the feet of anyone rushing through. They overturned heavy, ornate tables, creating a maze of cover and choke points. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. Every action with a specific, deadly purpose. They were on the balcony, Isabella having successfully exposed the winch mechanism for the central chandelier, while Logan used a length of speaker wire he'd stripped from the wall to rig a bypass, when Petrov's voice returned. This time, it wasn't through a single intercom. He had activated the ballroom's integrated public address system. His voice, amplified and echoing slightly in the vast space, surrounded them. A disembodied god of judgment. "An impressive effort," Petrov's voice boomed, laced with a mocking amusement that made Isabella's skin crawl. He was toying with them, watching their frantic preparations from some unseen camera. "Very creative, but you can't stop what's coming, Wraith. You can only delay it." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting their nerves fray. They froze, their work half finished, two figures caught in the spotlight of his voice. "You know, I've had a lot of time to think," Petrov continued, his tone shifting, losing its mocking edge and taking on the cold, hard weight of a long-nurtured grievance. "Years, in fact, in a hole that smelled of death and fear, and I kept coming back to one question. How? How could it all have gone so wrong?" He paused again, and then I found the answer. Sterling Industries. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Logan, whose face was a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the winch motor, his hands never ceasing their work. "Your father's unbreakable encryption," Petrov's voice dripped with venom. "The state of the art. Communications tech he sold to our government for a fortune. It failed at the single most critical moment of Operation Nightingale, Logan. It left us blind and deaf in the middle of enemy territory. I was captured, tortured, for 3 years. All because Sterling cut corners to win a defense contract, pushing a product that wasn't ready. And you." The focus of the voice shifted, becoming intensely personal, a blade aimed directly at Logan's heart. "Our leader. The one we trusted. You just disappeared. You knew the tech was faulty. You filed a preliminary report. I found the record, but when it mattered, you buried the final report. You walked away and let the official story stand, protecting your superiors and their cozy relationship with Sterling Industries, while the rest of us burned for it." The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. Isabella felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to grip the balcony railing to keep from falling. Her family's fortune, the galas, the private jets, the entire glittering facade of her life, it was built on this. On secrets and lies that had destroyed lives. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a consequence. It was a debt coming due. For Logan, the words were both a condemnation and a strange, bitter vindication. He had written the report. A detailed, scathing report that outlined every single failure of the Sterling tech. a report that should have court-martialed generals and bankrupted Sterling Industries. But it had been buried. He had been silenced, threatened, and given a choice: disappear and accept the official narrative, or be buried along with his report. He chose to disappear. For Maya's sake. He chose a life of quiet shame over a death with empty honor. Petrov's accusation was wrong, but the outcome was the same. He had failed his men. "So I'm here to collect," Petrov's voice echoed, cold and final. "A debt of blood and money. Your father will pay $100 million to get his daughter back, a fraction of what he made from our suffering, and his company's stock will be worthless when I leak the truth about his faulty tech to the world. And as a bonus," the voice dropped, becoming a low, menacing growl, "I get to settle the score with you, Wraith, the ghost who ran." The voice cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The traps were set. The motive was laid bare. Logan looked at Isabella, her face pale with horror and a dawning terrible understanding. He saw the shame in her eyes, the reflection of his own guilt. This was no longer just about survival. For Isabella, it was about confronting the ugly truth of her legacy. For Logan, it was a chance, after 10 long years of running, at a final, bloody redemption. He couldn't just save the heiress. He had to end this, for himself, for the men who had suffered and died under his command, and for the daughter he had to get back to. He finished his work on the wire, giving it a final, firm twist. The trap was ready, and the hunters were coming. The silence in the grand ballroom was a living thing, a coiled serpent of anticipation. The storm outside still raged, but in the vast, trap-laden room, the only sound was the frantic beating of 2 hearts and the faint, metallic groan of the compromised chandelier winch. Logan and Isabella stood on the balcony, hidden in the deep shadows behind the tapestry she had pulled aside, their gazes locked on the ballroom's main doors. The wait was an eternity compressed into minutes. Then, it ended. The ornate double doors burst inward, slamming against the walls with a deafening crash. Petrov strode in as if he owned the place, his cruel smile firmly in place, a high-caliber pistol in his hand. 3 of his men, all armed with tactical rifles, fanned out behind him, their movements disciplined and aggressive as they swept the seemingly empty room. Come out, wherever you are." "Wraith," Petrov's voice echoed, dripping with condescending amusement. "Let's finish this." His men advanced, stepping onto the polished marble floor. The first man, moving toward the center of the room, passed directly under the massive chandelier. That was the signal. Logan's hand, holding the stripped speaker wire, completed the circuit. On the balcony, the winch motor sparked violently and then screamed as the gears released. For a breathtaking second, the colossal fixture of crystal and brass hung suspended, and then it fell. It didn't just drop, it plummeted, a glittering avalanche of death that shattered on the marble floor in an explosion of sound and light. The man beneath it vanished in the cascade of metal and razor, sharp crystal shards. A second man, caught by the edge of the impact, was thrown sideways, his leg crushed and mangled by a heavy brass arm. Chaos erupted. Petrov and his remaining 2 men scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the shadows of the room. From her position on the balcony, Isabella acted. As the third intruder ducked behind an overturned table near the side wall, she shoved the massive, rolled-up tapestry she and Logan had prepared over the railing. The immense weight of the ancient fabric unfurled as it fell, landing directly on the man, enveloping him in a heavy, suffocating shroud of woven history. He thrashed and cursed, tangled and blinded, his rifle firing uselessly into the thick cloth. It was the opening Logan needed. He vaulted over the balcony railing, dropping the 12 feet to the floor below, landing in a silent, predatory crouch. Before the entangled man could free himself, Logan was on him, a single, precise strike to the base of the skull rendering him unconscious beneath his woolen prison. Now only Petrov and 1 man remained. The last soldier, seeing Logan exposed, raised his rifle. "Logan!" Isabella screamed, her voice raw with terror. Logan spun, but he was too far away, his pistol not in his hand. In that split second, Isabella didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy red CO2 fire extinguisher mounted to the wall, pulled the pin, and aimed the nozzle down at the man targeting Logan. A thick white cloud of freezing carbon dioxide gas erupted from the extinguisher, billowing down into the ballroom. It wasn't a weapon. but it was a perfect distraction. The blinding, suffocating cloud enveloped the gunman, who choked and sputtered, his aim completely thrown off as he recoiled from the sudden icy blast. That moment was all Logan needed. He closed the distance in 3 silent strides and disarmed the man with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. Now, it was just 2. In the center of the ruined ballroom, amidst the glittering debris of the chandelier and the overturned furniture, Logan and Petrov faced each other. The storm outside seemed to fade away, the world shrinking to this single, personal confrontation. They circled each other like wolves, 2 apex predators from the same forgotten pack, their shared history a toxic, palpable thing in the air between them. "Look at you," Petrov sneered, his cultured voice tight with years of hatred. "Still the animal, pretending to be a man, hiding in the dirt playing house. What will your precious daughter think when she finds out her daddy is a killer?" The mention of Maya was a physical blow, but Logan didn't flinch. The rage was there, a cold, controlled burn deep inside him. But it was no longer the wild, consuming fire of his past. "I'm not that man anymore," Logan said, his voice low and steady, a declaration of fact. "I'm a father, and you threaten my family." Petrov laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You are what you were made to be," he roared, and lunged. The fight was not a display of tactical grace, it was a brutal, personal explosion of violence. Petrov fought with the wild, desperate rage of a man who had nothing left to lose, his attacks fueled by years of festering hatred and perceived betrayal. He was strong and fast, a whirlwind of fists and feet, but Logan was different. He wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting for protection, for the quiet life he had built, for the little girl sleeping in a cellar, for the terrified woman watching from the balcony above. He fought with a cold, clear purpose. He met Petrov's furious, wide swings not with equal fury, but with precise, economical blocks and counters. He absorbed a punishing blow to his ribs that stole his breath, and answered with a sharp, targeted strike to Petrov's shoulder, dislocating it with a sickening pop. Petrov screamed in pain and rage, switching his pistol to his other hand. He fired, the shot going wide, shattering a marble bust against the far wall. Logan moved inside the arc of the gun, using Petrov's momentum against him. He twisted, a blur of motion, and with a sharp crack, he broke Petrov's arm. The pistol clattered to the floor. Petrov, howling, tried to tackle him, but Logan was already moving, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. As Petrov fell, Logan brought his foot down with calculated force on his opponent's leg, breaking it with a final, definitive crack of bone. Petrov lay broken and gasping on the debris-strewn marble floor, his body a ruin of shattered limbs and shattered pride. Logan stood over him, his chest heaving, the pain in his own body a dull, distant roar. He looked down at the man who had haunted his nightmares for a decade, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary finality. He bent down, not in anger, but with the cold authority of a commander, and looked his former comrade in the eye. "Identify yourself," Logan commanded, his voice resonating with the weight of his reclaimed identity. It was not a question, it was a declaration. He was no longer Wraith, the ghost. He was Logan Brooks, and he was done hiding. Dawn broke gray and weeping, the storm having finally exhausted itself. The first light illuminated a scene of surreal devastation on the Sterling estate. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars and ambulances washed over the manicured lawns, their strobing colors a jarring intrusion into the tranquil, morning mist. The intruders, including a broken and silently seething Petrov, were taken into custody, their professional operation ending in a quiet, ignominious defeat. A private helicopter descended onto the main lawn, its rotors whipping the damp air into a frenzy. The moment it touched down, the door slid open and a frantic Mr. Sterling emerged, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale with fear. He rushed to Isabella, who was wrapped in a paramedic's blanket, and enveloped her in a hug that was both possessive and genuinely relieved. After a moment, he turned to Logan, who stood nearby, his arm now properly bandaged, his face a mask of exhaustion. Mr. Sterling's expression shifted from relief to calculation. A checkbook seemed to almost magically appear in his hand. "Name your price," he said, his voice regaining its customary commanding tone. "Anything. $1 million. $5 million. For my daughter's life you can have whatever you want." Logan looked from the checkbook to the man holding it. Then his gaze shifted to Isabella, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "I don't want your money," Logan said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your money, and the corners you cut to make it, is what started this." Mr. Sterling flinched as if struck. Logan pressed his advantage. "But I'll take a job," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Head of your corporate security. All of it. I run it my way. No cut corners. No buried reports. I protect your people. All of them. Including your daughter. On my terms." Mr. Sterling stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He was a man used to buying solutions, to writing checks to make problems disappear. But Logan wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a consequence to be reckoned with. Humbled, shaken, and looking at his daughter's pale, determined face, the billionaire slowly nodded. "Agreed," he said, the word costing him more than any check he had ever written. A few days later, the gardens of the estate were once again peaceful. The scent of rain, washed earth, and blooming roses filled the air. Logan was walking with Maya along a gravel path, her hand tucked securely in his. She was chattering happily about a school project, her voice a bright, cheerful sound that was the only music Logan ever wanted to hear. He saw Isabella approaching them from the direction of the main house. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a sweater, and the formal, brittle distance that had always existed between them was gone, replaced by a warm, deep respect in her eyes. "I wanted to thank you, Logan," she said, stopping in front of them, "for everything." Logan managed a small, genuine smile. "I was just doing my job," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Isabella shook her head, a soft smile touching her own lips. "No, you weren't," she corrected him gently. "You were being who you are. Thank you for that." Her gaze fell to Maya, and her smile widened. "He's a hero, you know," she said to the little girl. Maya beamed. "I know, he's my dad." Isabella's eyes met Logan's over Maya's head. In that shared glance, an entire volume of unspoken understanding passed between them, the beginning of a powerful, unbreakable bond, forged in the crucible of violence and survival. She gave them a final, warm smile and walked away, leaving them to their quiet mourning. Logan watched her go, then looked down at his daughter, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. He put his arm around her small shoulders, pulling her close. A genuine, peaceful smile touched his lips, a smile free from the shadows of the past. He had finally done it. He had integrated the two halves of his life, the soldier and the father. He was no longer hiding. He was home. He was whole.